Good evening. I would like to deal with some general thoughts on government types and definitions, considerations applicable at large even and actually especially today. Why? Because apart from the inherent wickedness of man, whom Shakespeare properly described as a quintessence of dust, among the words defining political systems few are more general, ductile, malleable, and subject to almost endless interpretation as the word democracy. Also considering that many new and older tragedies of history, even today, hinge, at least in their theoretical explanation, on the interpretation or misinterpretation of this word, with so many meanings as to have almost become meaningless. I mean, of course, democracy. That being the case, a few related considerations I think are appropriate, especially when approaching a subject so political and even emotionally charged as the Russian Revolution. Because, to quote Shakespeare again, nothing is good or bad, but thinking makes it so. As no doubt you know, there are those who consider the Russian Revolution an infernal undertaking and mother of all evils, and others see it as the unique template for a possible mode of government as close as possible to the famous government of the people. The intent of our sketches is to offer a perspective on actual event, stripping them of as much as possible of propagandistic explanations or explanations that could be interpreted as such. Now then, everybody knows what democracy means, government of the people. Everybody knows it because every politician who achieves any measure of visibility goes out of his or her way to declare himself democratic. But democracy is both a mimetic and promiscuous word. For Alexis of Tocqueville, who toured America in the first part of the 19th century and wrote the famous book Democracy in America, democracy is a synonym of equality, of egalitarianism. For Herbert Spencer, a 19th century social philosopher who applied Darwin's theories to society at large, democracy is a synonym of difference, of natural selection. And it was Spencer and not Darwin who applied to society the expression survival of the fittest. This double definition of democracy would already lead us to conclude that democracy can accommodate everything, from egalitarianism to the prevailing of the strongest over the weakest. One characteristic on which there is no disagreement is that in a democratic government people must be active, whereas in other forms of government people are activated or acted upon. Another character, if you like, whose name is familiar, Rousseau, in the 6th chapter of his famous book Social Contract, he says that democracy is a form of association through which everyone, associating himself with everyone, obeys nevertheless only to himself and remains free, just as free as he was before democracy, that is. Rousseau also says that it belongs to democracy the power to choose their representatives, to assign limits to their power, as well as the right to remove them according to non-violent procedures. And all these definitions are short of suggesting full self-government, where citizens have an input on matters that affect them, which means that popular self-government belongs to dreamland. But, as we know, the words, the substantives, and the adjectives of politics are all ambiguous, and since they are the words of power used to exert and exercise power, they are instrumental. As for democracy, this is particularly evident by considering that, by a simple change of a little preposition, every government on earth, from the most egalitarian to the most autocratic or even theocratic, every government can be considered democratic. This ambiguity is due to a short preposition and is expressed by the difference between the democracy of the people and the democracy for the people. In this sense, the Soviet regime was democratic because everything that favors the interests of the people, the regime did. Equally democratic is a fascist regime, that is, an organized democracy, centralized, authoritarian, at the service of the people and of the nation. We can see, as I said, how by a simple exchange of prepositions we can essentially call democracy anything we like. Why then, we may ask, all over the world, he who exercises political function is so eager to qualify himself as democratic, overcoming or accepting a violence which is both lexical, if you like, and ideological? We should add that democracy, ever since people started studying how to live together, has been associated with negative ideas. The ideas of standardization, of mediocrity, of hedonism, of materialism, of caprice, and of the violence of the number without quality, therefore a constellation of negative values. Why then democracy has become a magic word, a passport without which it is impossible to be admitted to the assembly of peoples, of governments, and of the civil states? Why has it become a title of respectability which no ruler can give up? And particularly today, when a scientific reflection on democracy leads to skepticism, at least I think so, and to the charge of democracy being a regime of simulation and dissimulation, that is, a regime of the hypocrisy of power. The point is that democracy must reckon with a mutation whose causes are endemic, that is, they reside inside democracy itself. And it is a mutation that is not caused by the enemies of democracy. Rather, it derives from toxins existing inside itself. This mutation, we can call it this way, if we can call it this way, is the oligarchic mutation. This fact, obvious the moment we think about it, is denounced by those who at one time were considered leftists, as well as by the rightists, meaning that those who proclaim democracy as the government of the people are either naive or impostors. In the classical theory of the forms of government, the oligarchy as the government imposed on the powerless by the few and powerful, this government lies between the monarchy, the government of one, and democracy, the government of many, the government of all. Therefore, in theory, oligarchy lies in the middle, but in practice, however, there is only the oligarchy of various kinds, big or small, more or less structural, centralized, and hierarchical, but always and only oligarchies. And this is true with regard to the monarchy, however unthinkable monarchy may be today. The monarch or the despot in reality is always the expression of an organized group that in various ways supports the monarch or the despot and at the same time keeps him or them harnessed. But the same thing applies to the opposite of absolute monarchy or despotism, that is, it applies to democracy. History shows that democracy in the form defined by Rousseau does not exist and never has existed, except for the ephemeral, the small, the short moments of glory as expressed by Joseph de Maistre, the great reactionary critic of the French Revolution. These moments of glory, happen at the beginning, when the establishment of the people's power breaks down the hierarchical structures of the past. They are indeed moments of glory, but fleeting and destructive. Critics of democracy warn that in general every democratic government is but a fleeting meteor whose brilliance excludes duration. And the same critics add that this fleeting moment of democratic exhilaration, if you like, generates destruction and the risk of having to be paid for dearly in the long run. Even Rousseau ends up referring to a democratic illusion as the effect of a practical impossibility. An impossibility admitting no exception, and referred to as the iron law of the oligarchies, a definition we owe to Robert Michaels, a sociologist who lived at the beginning of the 20th century. That is, when the people, the large numbers, have conquered equality, that's when the people need the small numbers. They need the restricted oligarchies. But this is not enough. Since the oligarchies are a clear contradiction of the principles of democracy, it is necessary that these oligarchies be concealed and that they conceal their concealment. They do this by maximizing the public display of pretending that they, the oligarchs, are the very expression of democracy. The conclusion, unfortunately, is that democracy is the regime of illusion, with the regrettable corollary that the most benign of political regimes in appearance, in reality, is actually the most evil. Said it another way, the majority principle, which is the essence of democracy, turns itself around and becomes the minority principle, which is the essence of autocracy. It is an autocracy that relies on large numbers, but it is still an autocracy. And for this reason, a power more dangerous in itself and not less dangerous than power in the hands of few people who rely only on themselves. And this was the argument of the critics of the 1789 revolution, especially Joseph de Maistre, whom I mentioned earlier on. There have been even more rash critics of democracy, Plato and Herodotus, for example, for whom democracy was the oppression of the virtue of the few, forced the few to be part of the vices of the many. For critics of the French Revolution, democracy is always the rule of the few over the many, or more precisely, it is democracy in a degenerated sense, a power not of the majority of the people, but of a minority through the majority, a majority that is used as a tool by others. I should answer here a probable objection by viewers who have followed this episode so far. What has this to do with the Russian Revolution? And you're right, it has not. However, through this humble attempt to place some concept we take for granted, to place them in the proper perspective, we may perhaps understand better the dynamics of the Russian Revolution and why the Russian Revolution has attracted such extremes of hatred and of admiration extant this day, 100 years later. But let's return for a little longer to the ambiguity of democracy, which is an illusion, and to today's oligarchies, which are unfortunately the reality. How can oligarchies come about? Political scientists have studied the birth of oligarchies and of their conflicts. A more familiar term than oligarchy, a term that brings it near to the life of everybody, is that of a caste or clique. Caste suggests an analogy with the caste system of India, which is essentially horizontal, with no communication or interferences between the social strata. With us, oligarchies change. They adapt to the prevailing or perceived social condition. They adopt symbols and methods conforming to the spiritual conditions of our time and producing a kind of legitimizing culture that responds to the changing expectations of the masses. Of course, a different chapter should deal with the role of the corporate media in arbitrarily determining what are the expectations of the masses, but this would bring us too far and from the intended subject. The oligarchies of today develop in societies of individuals free to do what they want and free to bind with those they want to bind with. Oligarchies grow and are free to modify and destroy themselves in circular motions, ascending and descending, where everything is confused. It is the idea of a circle, something that moves from the bottom to the top, a cogwheel, if you like, that grabs which is at the bottom and tends to bring it up in its movement. If we could use a new definition, it is the democracy of the circular entourage. And to understand the difference between caste and circular entourage, we must shed some light on a latent division on which the media is completely silent, because to expose this division would go against the interest of the circular entourage, which itself constitutes the media. It is the conflict between those who belong and those who do not belong precisely to any circular entourage, to any clique, to any circle of power. And I say clique because clique is exactly what we mean when in front of some people completely unknown, of dubious skills, of uncertain merits and certain demerits, who occupy places and positions hardly conceivable based on what they are or appear to be. In place of these people, we ask ourselves, what clique does he or she belong to? Who has never asked himself How in heaven or in hell could a person like this come to this position of power? What clique does he belong to? Indeed, one of the great divisions of our society is precisely between those who belong and those who do not belong to a clique or to a particular circular entourage. It is a profound division made up of careers, status, envy, and resentment. It is a division that poisons relationships, that corrupts social ties, but until it lasts, it represents a true constitutional and material structure. Members of a clique exchange protection and favors with loyalty and services, and this exchange needs a medium of exchange, for example, easy money or remunerative employment, or careers or promotions, and the other side, the receiver of favors, must give something in exchange. It could be thousands of votes controlled through unions, or plainly crime, or in exchange for the rewards given for belonging to the clique, it returns favors directly or through interposed persons, for example, in the case of sex. This apparently aseptic clique or circular entourage is in reality a sewer that infects at large everything it touches. But what is the force? What is the force that keeps these wheels of the clique turning? The protections and favors bestowed at the top of the wheel, while the allegiance and services given in exchange are at the bottom of the wheel. And at first impression, distributing favors may seem like a beneficial system for those who belong to it, a form of democracy, an example of power for the people, to the people who are at the bottom of the wheel. But it is not so. Each sees in the other only resources to exploit, and each clique, each wheel of power is a crucible of competition, often ferocious. To climb higher, competitors pound on each other. On the highest step, we find only arrogance, and on lowest steps, only servility. Arrogance at the top and servility at the bottom. On the intermediate steps, the participants of the clique are arrogant with those below and servile with those above. And as you go up and down the wheel, the relationships between arrogance and servility changes. Masters and servants, at all levels of the wheel, are bound by unwritten agreements, but they are agreements and pacts between accomplices. Fidelity to the covenant is nourished and guaranteed by favors and threats, blandishments, intimidation, and blackmail. And what is the force that keeps the wheel of the circular entourage, the wheel of the clique turning? It is a force that feeds on inequality and illegality. The cliques spread in proportion to social inequalities and in proportion to how less the same laws are applied equally to all. The more insecurity and the social injustice, the more the need of protection, that is, the need for patronage. And the more the patronage, the more frequent the violations of the law, which in the abstract should be the same for all. Democracy then, in the absence of equality and legality, becomes a concealment of systems of power which are hierarchical and are based on the unequal exchange of favors between the powerful and the powerless, and on the generalized illegality favoring those who belong to the oligarchy. Today, this structure of power is extended as never before. It is capillary. It is pervasive. If only for a moment we could lift the veil and have a vision of the whole, we would probably be stunned at the face of reality hidden behind the representation of democracy. Vertical chains of power, always invisible, almost always invisible, and often secret, link the men of politics, of the bureaucracy, of the judiciary, the professions, even the ecclesiastical hierarchies, the economy, finance, university, culture, entertainment. These links involve the countless numbers of agencies, councils, centers, foundations, etc., that according to their principle should be mutually independent. Instead, they are attracted in the same eddies of power, roles that corrupt power. They corrupt power, skills, and responsibilities. The iron law of the oligarchies that I mentioned earlier leads us to say that such oligarchical transformation is the inevitable transformation of democracy towards which we should assume a realistic, perhaps, rather than moralistic attitude, because we cannot do anything about it. The realistic rather than moralistic attitude, it says, should be adopted when evaluating, and in the moralistic attitude I include all the theories, sometimes bordering on the insane, whose remnants have enabled the current grotesque theories of pretended Russian interference in the US presidential election of 2016 as was an example of grotesqueness. But it is also an example of the theory of cliques, as I have attempted to illustrate. The mass media, as we all know, now constitutes but one clique, larger than many others, but still one circular entourage as described before. I am Jim Molia for Historical Sketches. Good night.
You can join on this next song. It's simply "Oh, the River Calls" and "Oh, the Mighty River Calls." This is from a 22-day canoe trip down the Sheen-Drek River in the Arctic National Wildlife Refuge. Born of the mountain and the Arctic wind. And your first part goes, oh, the river calls, northern lights and the glacier's kin. And your other part goes, oh, how the mighty river calls. The river's a treasure that you cannot buy. Let me hear you. Oh, the river calls. She's a glint in an eagle's eye. Oh, how the mighty river calls. The river's a promise of things to come, a ribbon of hope shining in the sun. The river is life for the great and small. Oh, it's a call of the wild that the mighty river calls. River's a spirit flowing sweet and strong. Oh, the river calls. She's the way beckons me to come. Oh, how the mighty river calls. The river's a lifeline, flowing clean and true. Let me hear ya. Oh, the river calls to the heart of the land of the caribou. Oh, how the mighty river calls. The river's a promise of things to come, a ribbon of hope shining in the sun. The river is a life for the great and small. Oh, it's a call of the wild that the mighty river calls. The river's a journey borne by some. Oh, the river calls. She's away, beckons me to come. Oh, how the mighty river calls. The river's a promise of things to come, a ribbon of hope shining in the sun. The river is a life for the great and small. Oh, it's a call of the wild that the mighty river calls. The river's a promise of things to come, a ribbon of hope shining in the sun. The river is a life for the great and small. Oh, it's a call of the wild that the mighty river calls. Oh, it's a call of the wild that the mighty river calls. Oh, it's a call of the wild that the mighty river calls. What a life we could live if we could walk this land with respect for all. Oh, what a life we could live